you ever found yourself in this posture of yearning? But not just any yearning, the type of yearning that comes from the wilderness, the type of yearning that comes from a place where you're standing in the rubble of dreams that once were, or the type of yearning that comes from the desert, the type of yearning that comes from the dark and the depths of our soul. I'm there. I find myself standing in the rubble of so many dreams that once were. Beginning in 2016, God has taken me on a journey in the wilderness of loss, of liminality, of wandering. And yet I find myself in this wilderness place, in the rubble of longing and praying and yearning and hoping, even amid the lament. And I realize that in most places that I go and I see people around me, that there's always someone somewhere that is going through something, and perhaps you too are that someone somewhere that finds yourself yearning and longing from the depths and the rubble and from the wilderness. There's a tradition in Scripture called Lament. And in the book of Lamentations, we see the first 3.5 chapters of Jeremiah the prophet weeping over the state of Israel, of weeping over the state of the people of God. So much so that you get the sense that he is even asking God, where are you? God, are you even here? God, do you see me in my pain? And for the first 2 chapters, we see this just continuation. You can hear his tears as he weeps and as he laments from the wilderness and the depths. In fact, in chapter 3, verse 18, he says, "My splendor is gone, and all that I had hoped from the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and all the gall." See, this is 3.5 chapters so far of this continuing lament. And then in verse 20, there's a sudden reversal in tone, almost seemingly out of nowhere. He shifts his tone. He says, "I will remember them." This is verse 20. "I will remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet I call this to mind, and therefore I have hope." Let me say that again. "Yet I call this to mind," he says, "and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." The prophet and poet is afflicted. He is lamenting over the state of the people of God and longing for God to see his affliction. But then there's suddenly this jolt where he says, "And yet I have hope. And yet I recall that God is faithful. And yet I recall that God's mercies are new every day. And yet I recall that God is a covenant God. And yet I recall that God's hesed, that God's love is unending." And we see this sudden reversal. And what the poet asks of those who are joining him in this lament and in this reversal are that even in the rubble and the pain and the places where we find ourselves yearning from the depths, to wait patiently upon the Lord. To wait, that as though we look around as so many wander through the wilderness, whether it be loss or COVID-19 or lament over the state of the church in America or the polarization in the world, refugee crisis, whatever it might be, there's so much to lament. And we might be wondering, God, where are you? Do you see our affliction? Do you see our pain? And here what the prophet reminds us is to recall on the promises of God, to remember that God is faithful, and to wait patiently. But this image of waiting is not just a passive waiting, twiddling our thumbs, but it's an image of a child pressing his face up against the window, looking and waiting for mom and dad to come. It's a preparation, it's a readiness. We don't just sit and wait, but we are actively waiting. You see, whenever I have guests into my home, there's a long preparation process. I make my to-do list, I make my timeline of when I want to have food in the oven, so that way I am ready for when the guests come. I am waiting for them to come, but I am also actively waiting. And my family always knows when I'm having guests over because of the final step that I always do right before guests come. I go through the house and I light all the candles. I love candles. And whenever we have guests come, it's always a special time to light every candle in the house. And sometimes you might even find me lighting the luminaries even along the driveway if we're having more guests over. I love it when the house glows with warmth and with candles. It's an active readiness. And you see, what the prophet and the poet is asking those to do who are lamenting and are waiting upon the Lord aren't just to wait and twiddle our thumbs, but to be a people who light the fire of hope, who light the candles. And in their waiting, there is a readiness that their lights are shining in such a way that the weary world, who is also standing in the rubble and the pain and the grief and the loss, would see this attractive and radiant light shining, so that a weary world would rejoice. I am yearning from the depths. I'm longing for a new day. But we don't just wait for that new day. We actively wait. We light the candle of hope so that a weary world might rejoice.